Hi, welcome to this video about Joranalogue Audio Design's Step 8. The release of this module is very much anticipated because it was already released or announced at Superbooth last year, but due to several delays it's only now that the module is on the verge of being released in the shops. So of course we thought it would be a good idea that I made a video about this, and because I know that DivKit will do a very in-depth video about Step 8, I didn't just want to make an extensive playthrough at this point in time. So instead I chose to make some basic patches with Step 8 to show you some of the things that you can do with it, as well as showing you how to build these patches with the modules in your rack. And along the way, the functionality of Step 8 should be getting somewhat clearer. The patches in this video aren't really elaborate patches, they're really rather basic. The module is confusing enough as it is, so I wanted to keep it simple. I've linked all the documents that I'm showing in this video in the description. You can just download these and have a look at them at your own pace. And of course I want to thank Joranalogue Audio Design for giving me the opportunity to do this video on this amazing module. It's a rather long video, but as usual I made the timing index in the description so you can just skip around as you want. So yeah, let's just get started. So let's figure out how to set up Step 8 like a sequencer, and along the way I'll explain some of the features of the module. So for this to work, we want to connect the scan output. Let me run it through the scope, and let's route that signal to the volt per octave input of an oscillator. When we are in cycle mode, the scan output just sends out the voltage of the active step. Here you can see that only one LED on the sliders is lit, but as soon as I switch Step 8 to all, you'll see that every LED, at least of the sliders, is lit up. A better way to tell which step you're on is by watching the LEDs for the gate outputs. Let's switch back to solo. Actually, for using Step 8 as a simple sequencer, it really doesn't matter. Neither does the setting for track or sample, but it's just easier this way to see what's happening. So moving the slider changes the voltage that's sent out of the scan output. And you can see this voltage changing on the scope as well. It's the top trace, the green one. And as long as this step is active, connecting the individual analog output for the first step sends out the same voltage as the scan output. Now when we go to the next step, we can do this by pressing this button here. You'll notice that the voltage drops to 0, and none of the movements to the first slider have any effect. To hear what the voltage of the second step here is doing, we need to listen to the second analog output or the scan output. Let's move all these sliders a bit. And to get our sequencer going, we just need to connect a clock signal to the step input on Step 8. Now my VCO is going straight into the mixer, but let's patch it through a VCA really quickly. And we can use the step output on step 8 to trigger this VCA. The step output on step 8 sends out a trigger whenever step 8 changes to another step. It doesn't matter if this is happening by sending in a clock or going through the steps with a CV signal. And now you can just use step 8 as an 8-step analog sequencer. In this mode, when nothing is connected to the CV input, the output of the scan output as well as the analog output will always be a signal between 0 and plus 5 volts. Now, instead of stepping through the steps of step 8 by sending in a clock, let's connect a looping envelope coming from METS to the stage input. Let's slow this down. And as you can hear, you can just go through the steps with external CV. This stage input reacts to 0 to 5 volt signals. So while you can use an LFO to go through the steps, it will only react to the portion of the LFO that's between 0 and 5 volts. An interesting thing to try is to connect a chaotic or random control voltage to the stage input. Here I'm using orbit 3. But for now, let's go back to the clock signal. Now there's other things that you can do. For example, you can pause step 8 by sending in a 5 volt gate. Here I'm just using a channel of METS that generates a DC offset. Now I'm turning the knob to the right. And now I'm turning it back to 0. So again, by sending in a random or chaotic gate, you can get this kind of behavior out of step 8. Let's connect the gate output of orbit 3 to the reverse input. Now sending a 5 volt gate to this input causes the direction of step 8 to reverse. The behavior of this reverse feature here is not switching or flip-flop like. It only reverses when the gate is high. And you can combine all these things as well. Here I'm using an LFO into the CV or stage input. And you can see whenever there's sensible or useful CV voltage coming into the stage input, it will take control over which step 8 is on. Another thing that's interesting to mention here is the reset input. So if you just want a 4-step sequence, you use the gate output of step 5 and you connect this to the reset input. Of course, you can go for odd numbers, which is always very interesting in my opinion. Now let's send the chaotic gate back into the reverse input. And by combining all these features, you can really find interesting patches. example, you can send an LFO into the pause, reverse or reset input as well. And this can get really interesting really quickly. Let's add some reverb to this patch. Let's tune down my oscillator a little bit. Now let's have a look how to set up step 8 to use for hocketing. And in my opinion, hocketing is a really weird and confusing word for something that's really rather easy to understand. Hocketing is a technique used in songwriting and arrangements to let different instruments or different voices play consecutive notes of one sequence or one melody. Let me play back a simple sequence here. This is just an 8-step sequence coming from Moscow 2. It's going through the scope, it's the blue trace. I'm using the black cables here because I don't have any blue cables, which is kind of weird. Now it would be a lot more interesting if the consecutive notes were played by a different sounding synth voice. And this is really easy to achieve with step 8. So first of all, you need to run a sequence into step 8. I'm just using the same sequence that's running through the scope and I'm patching it into the CV input on step 8. And now you can see that the scan output connected with the green cable here, it's the green trace, produces the exact same voltages as the sequence, which is the blue trace. I'm going to use these two voices. This is the first voice, and this is the second voice. Pan them slightly to the left and the right, and as you can hear, these are tuned to the same note. Now let's connect the analog output of step 1 to the first voice. Actually, let me run it through the scope. Now I'm doing the same thing for the second voice. For this I will use the analog output of the second step. I'm running it through the scope as well. Let's connect it to the voltproctive input of my second voice. Now at the moment nothing is happening, and this is because my sequence is 8 steps long and step 8 is running at 8 steps as well. Let's shorten the sequence to 6 steps. But to make this work correctly, since we're only using 2 voices, we need to force step 8 to always cycle between the 2 first steps. And to do this, you simply connect the third gate output to the reset input. Now let's go back to a sequence of 8 steps. And for this to work, you need to use the cycle mode. You also need to set this switch to all. Listen to what happens when I switch this to solo. While this can sound interesting, in this mode, every time step 8 moves to the second step, the voltage of the first analog output falls down back to 0. And it's a lot more interesting if every step holds its voltage until it samples or tracks a new one. To make it a little more interesting, let's route both of the voices through a separate VCA. And then of course I need something to trigger the envelopes that I'm using to attenuate the signal with the VCA. And for this I'm using the gate outputs for the according voice. So the first gate output goes to the trigger for the first voice, and the second gate output goes to the trigger for the second voice. To use step 8 for hocketing, you can use the track setting or the sample setting. It doesn't really matter that much until you of course introduce some glide or slew to the sequence that you're sending into the CV input here. You can hear that when I'm on the track setting, this glide is present in the analog outputs, but when I switch to sample, it won't be there. And this really illustrates the difference between track and hold and sample and hold for each step, which are all track and hold modules. They're just stacked together in one nice module. For each of these, when you're using the track setting, it lets the voltage through until the end of the step, and then it holds the voltage. In the sample setting, it samples the voltage at the start of the step. So any changes that happen while the step is active won't affect the output signal, either for the scan outputs or the analog outputs, when you're on the sample setting. And on the track setting, changes to the incoming voltage while the step is active will be present at these outputs. Now let's change up the sequence a little bit. And now let's just add one more voice to show you the potential of this technique. I'm just going to use orbit 3 in audio mode, and this is hocketing by just using one sequence coming from Moscow 2 and distributing the consecutive notes to different voices. With step 8 you create this interesting pushing and pulling between the different voices. That's a lot more interesting than when we would use this sequence to just drive one voice. Let me show you how you can create these kind of wonderful polyphonic patches by using step 8 to distribute the signals coming from the sequencer. I've gone ahead and prepared two VCOs that are almost perfectly in tune with each other. I would say it's close enough. I've also gone ahead and made a sequence. This sequence is coming from Moscow 2 and it's being clocked by the same clock that I'm using to clock step 8. This is something that I forgot to mention in the previous patch about hocketing, is that for it to work like I'm showing you, here you need to use the same clock for your sequencer and for step 8. Let's remove this sequence and let's connect it to the input on step 8. Of course, you can't hear anything happening because I've yet to connect the pitch CV to the VCOs. But let's first have a look at the scope here. So the green trace on data is the sequence coming directly from the sequencer, and the output of data is going into step 8. I switched this switch here to the right position, which is the shift position, and in this mode step 8 functions as a shift register. Now what a shift register is, it's essentially in the name. It tracks or samples the voltage, and then when it receives a clock pulse, it shifts that voltage to the next step. And this is completely different from what we've been doing before. And for example, in the previous patch, when I connected a sequence here and clocked the sequencer and step 8 with the same clock, when I start them both together on the first step, the sequencer and step 8, the first note of the sequence will be tracked or sampled by the first step on step 8. The second note of the sequence would be tracked or sampled on the second step, etc. But when you're in shift mode, this is simply not the case. The first step would track or sample the first step of our sequence, the first note. Then when the second note hits, the first note switches to the second step, and the first step will track or sample the second note of the sequence. I know this is really confusing, but this is really useful for creating polyphonic patches where you kind of shift the notes towards the next voices, and in this mode it's not necessary to reset step 8 by self-patching because the last note will always be present here, and step 8 just keeps shifting those notes to the right until you of course run out of voices. I haven't connected any voices yet, so let's start doing that. So I'll connect the first drag and hold circuit here. I'll connect this to data. And just by watching the scope, you can see that the first analog output on step 8 always reproduces the sequence that we are sending in. By the way, in this mode, at least for what I'm trying to show you, it's no use connecting the scan output because this just sends out a constant voltage and we can't use this now. And let's go ahead and connect this signal to the first VCO here. So this was the sequence that we started off with. And for the pitch CV of the second voice, I'm using the second analog output. Let me patch it through data and into my volt per octave input on the VCO. And I deliberately made a slow moving sequence so you can hear but also see that the second analog output when using step 8 in shift mode is just the same sequence as the one we started off with, the one we are sending in, but it's shifted by 1 clock pulse. And you can see when I use the third step here on step 8 that it indeed just moves another step to the right. But let's stick to the second output here. Now, instead of running these VCOs straight into my mixer, I want to route them through 2 separate VCAs. You could mix these VCOs and send them to 1 VCA, but that's completely up to you. Now, to trigger these VCAs, I'm just going to use the clock. So I can use the step output here. And I'm melting this off screen because I'm using this trigger to trigger both the VCAs. Or I should say I'm triggering the envelopes that control the attenuation of the VCA. Now let's increase the clock speed a little bit. And let's change up our sequence. And if you have 3 VCOs that sound kind of similar, you can connect the third one to the third step output, or analog output I should say, the fourth one to the fourth analog output, etc. And this has really no use, but it's just to demonstrate to you that we're actually only using 2 steps, even though I'm not resetting step 8. And the biggest difference between using step 8 as a shift register instead of using it for hocketing is really the way the steps of the sequence are distributed amongst these analog outputs. When you want to make polyphonic patches, it makes so much more sense to use step 8 in shift register mode, but when you want to distribute consecutive steps of your melody to different voices or different instruments, it makes more sense to use the cycle setting. Of course, there's some overlap between these 2 features or uses of step 8, and in some patches it's even not completely clear which one you should use or which one would sound the best. But I would encourage you, if you get a step 8, to just experiment with it, and you can even set it up in a certain way. Just flick this switch mid-patch and listen to what happens. Sometimes this is really interesting. Again, it's important to use the all setting for this kind of thing, because if you don't, the voltage of the analog outputs falls back to 0 whenever the step is not active. Okay, let's add some reverb to this. And again, this is a really interesting way to do more with just one sequence. And of course, when you start attenuating these sliders, this will affect the pitch of the output, as you can see on the scope as well. Now this won't be in pitch at all, but just to demonstrate what would happen. Let's have a quick look how to use step 8 for a simple but classic sample and hold patch. I've connected one of the white noise outputs from static by feedback modules to the top trace on data here. To make a classic sample and hold patch, you usually use white noise, but you can also use pink noise. I'm going to connect the white noise to the input on step 8. Let's connect the scan output of step 8 to data as well. And let's just connect this to the mixer and have a listen. What's important to mention at this point is that I'm still on the track setting. Now, to be able to do sample and hold, you need to switch, of course, to the sample setting. Let's connect this signal, you can already see it here, to the volt per octave input on a VCO, and let's unmute this VCO. And even though step 8 has 8 sample and hold modules or track and hold modules, when you're in the cycle mode, you could look at this as if the 8 consecutive sample and hold modules or circuits are routed consecutively to the scan output by using an internal sequential switch, something like the A151 from Dupfer. Now, normally to do anything musical with this, you would run this through a quantizer, but you would also attenuate the noise beforehand or attenuate the CV signal after the sample and hold circuit. But on step 8, you can just use the sliders for this. Now you might think this is all very annoying, that I need to adjust 8 sliders. Well, then you just reset step 8 after the first step. And in practice, for a patch like this, it makes no difference at all. But now you have one slider which attenuates the level of the CV output. I deliberately left the 0 axis in here, and as you can see, the voltage at the output can go below 0. Now, in the previous patch examples, I always used a pitch sequence to send into step 8, and this is by definition always a positive signal, but you can also sample or track negative voltages. Now, one thing to keep in mind when looking at the LED here, the LED will only light up for voltages between 0 and 5 volts. So when you're sending a bipolar signal into the input of step 8, the fact that the LED is unlit does not mean that there is no signal. It does not mean that the output is 0 volt. It just means that the voltage might be below 0, and you still can attenuate negative voltages as well. Now let me remove this reset signal here. As you can see, I can attenuate certain steps and leave other ones unattenuated. You can really choose this yourself. You can make kind of pseudo-random patches with this. But I think it's also important to have a look and listen to what the analog outputs are doing. I'm just going to use the first analog output because that's easier to keep track of. As long as this switch is on the all setting, the first stage, the first sample and hold circuit, so the first analog output here, will always send out the voltage of the first step. And you can see when I switch this to solo, it only sends out the voltage of the first step while the step is active. But you can really easily see that this voltage is always the same as the scan output on the first step. Now, and when I switch it to the all setting, it just holds that voltage until the next cycle. An interesting thing to do, I have another VCO prepared here, tuned 1 octave lower than the one we're listening to. Let me connect it and unmute this. You could use this for creating harmonies. And now you can still go ahead and mute certain steps. Let's add some reverb to this. And of course, when you use the second step, which we attenuated to send to the second VCO, this will just always send out 0 volts. Now let's mute our first VCO. So now we're just listening to the one that I'm pitch sequencing with the red cable here. Let's have a listen to what happens when we switch to the track setting. And now you can very clearly hear that the noise that we're sending in, the green trace here, gets through while the step is active, but at the end of the step the voltage is sampled and held until the next cycle. Unless, of course, I switch to solo. Then this analog output will only send out a signal when the step is active. I don't know if I already mentioned it, but for this all to work, you need to be in the cycle setting here. And if you would run these two signals, the signal from the scan output and one of the analog outputs, or many of the analog outputs, if you would run these both through quantizers, this would instantly make for an interesting melody in the scale of your choice that's always changing, but over which you have some control with the 8 sliders on step 8. You might have noticed just now that the pitch went up while I was sliding the slider downwards. And this might confuse you. I know it confused me at some point, but this just means that the sampled voltage of the second step was a negative voltage, and by attenuating it you bring it closer to 0. So when using this for pitch, the pitch goes up. Let's have a quick look at how to perform sample rate reduction with step 8. I'm just going to use a sine wave from January 3. Let's run it through data so you can see it. Let's connect the output of data into the CV input here. Let me connect the scan output of step 8 through data to the mixer, and at this point we won't hear anything because I still need to connect a clock to step 8 to step through its cycle. Now, instead of connecting a clock from Pamela's new workout or whatever clock source you are using, I'm going to use another sine wave to clock step 8. So I'm just connecting the sine wave, the fundamental output of another generator here, but of course you can use every oscillator for this. And let's connect it to the step input. And when I turn up this second oscillator, the one I'm using as a clock, really high, there's barely any change, but you can already hear that there's some kind of distortion going on. Let me slow down this clock and you'll start hearing and seeing on the scope the effect of the sample rate reduction. Now when I turn this one really low back into LFO rates, you can see that just like before, step 8 is just going through its steps. For each step it samples the incoming CV value. Please notice that I'm on the sample setting. The solo or all setting does not matter, and I'm using the cycle setting here. So let me go back to an audio rate clock here. And by playing around with the frequency of this clock, you can create this sample rate reduction effect. And you don't need to stick to a sine wave as a sound source. You can run samples through there, plug in your guitar. You can even run complete mixes through this. Now these kind of sample rate reduction effects are really very interesting when you use them for dynamic signals. Let me just run my sine wave here through a wave folder. Let's do a little bit more here. I'm going to connect a sequence coming from Moscow 2 to the volt per octave input on the signal on the VCO that I've connected to the main input here. So that's the one we're actually listening to, the one we're performing sample rate reduction on. And let me connect an envelope to this sine wave. And of course I need to trigger that envelope. Let's just for a moment listen to how this sounds. So this is not going through step 8, this is just what I'm sending into step 8. Let's reconnect it to step 8. And if we now play around with the frequency of the VCO that I'm using to clock all of this, you get these nice formant-like sample rate reduction sounds. Let's quickly connect a drum to this. And to make this even more interesting, I'm just going to modulate the frequency of the VCO that's setting the sample rate and clocking step 8. And let's add some reverb. Making custom wave shapes with step 8 is really easy. All you need to do is send in an audio rate signal, an oscillator, into the step input to use as a clock. So this is the VCO I'm using. And now let's connect that same VCO to use as a clock for step 8. I've routed the scan output through data. It's going into the mixer. I'm in the cycle mode. The switch is here set to solo. It doesn't really matter when you're listening to the scan output. And here we are on the sample setting, but the track setting works just as well. And as you can see, because of the way I set up these sliders, we get a nice pulse wave output that's oscillating between 0 and 5 volts. And it's when you start moving these sliders that you can make all these interesting shapes, going from narrow pulse waves to very wide ones, and really everything in between. And as you can see, you can even create some kind of saw wave. And when you run this through, well, I wanted to say a slew limiter, but since these are audio rate signals, I think using a filter makes more sense. Filter 8 can be used as both. But let's connect the scan output of... Oh, and by the way, if you're listening to the gate outputs here, these just produce narrow pulse waves. And so do the analog outputs, as long as you don't switch them to the all setting, at which point there's no oscillation going on, because they always keep their voltage. So let's connect the scan output of step 8 to the input of my filter. And let's listen to the filter output. And now as I turn down the frequency of the filter, you'll see that I can get rid of the sharp edges. Let's connect a pitch sequence coming from Moscow 2 to the oscillator that I'm using as a clock for step 8. Let's add some delay to this. You could even connect an LFO to the input on step 8, and this would result in kind of amplitude modulation sounds. You can also see that this makes the output wave oscillate between being positive and negative. This is because the LFO that we're sending in is actually being tracked. But for every step, the voltage that comes out of the scan output and the analog outputs is restricted by the setting of the slider. So when you're using step 8 just as a sequencer, which is essentially what we're doing here, it's just at audio rates, it only sends out positive voltages, and that's because there's plus 5 volts normaled to the input here. But when you send in your own signal for whatever you want to do with it, the sampled or tracked values can be negative. And it can be really much fun to just experiment with this, because you can make really interesting sounds sometimes. Let's turn up the rate of the oscillator that I'm using to amplitude modulate my output. And actually I say amplitude modulate, but this is really more ring mod because it's going below 0 as well. So this can give you really cool sounds. Let's turn down the rate of the LFO again. This is a really similar setup to the sample and hold patch I showed you, but now I'm sending in a sine wave instead of a noise source. It's going through data, it's the green cable, also the green trace on top of data here. I'm sending in a clock to the step input. You know this by now. You can judge the rate of the clock by watching the lights for the gate outputs here. And then I'm running the scan output through data into my mixer. And I showed you before, when you switch step 8 to the track mode, it just lets through the signal pretty much unchanged. And I want to show you something that I've hinted about before. You can mute separate steps by attenuating the sliders here. And doing this, you can send in any sound you want into the input of step 8 here and create a sliced or chopped effect. You can, of course, also just attenuate the sliders by a little bit. And this creates a really dynamic sound from just one sine wave. Let's add some drums to give you some kind of backbone to what the tempo and the rhythm are doing. Now, instead of using Pamela's new workout to trigger these drums, I can just as well use the step outputs of step 8, which send out a 5-volt gate whenever a step is active. And now, instead of sending in a sine wave, let's send in some white noise. For this I'm using static here by feedback modules. And as you can hear, you can create a hi-hat pattern just by sending in noise into step 8 and playing around with the sliders. Now, instead of running the output of step 8, the scan output, straight into the mixer, I'm going to route it through a VCA with a built-in envelope. And as a trigger for this envelope, I can just use the signal coming from the step output, which is the same signal that's going in in this setup. So that's just a clock. You can use step 8 as a clock divider or as a sequencer for generating trigger or gate patterns. For this, you simply connect a clock into the step input. I'm using this LED cable, so it's easier to see the clock rate. Let's patch up a hi-hat. This hi-hat is just triggered by the same clock I'm using here. So now by just using one of the gate outputs here, I'm just going to use the first one because that makes sense to me. Let's trigger a kick drum with this. Now instead of using this gate to trigger a drum sample, you could of course also use this to clock another sequencer or sync an LFO2. And at the moment this is a divide by 8. Now perhaps you want a divide by 6, that's possible as well. For this you just force step 8 to reset after the 6th step. For this you connect the gate output of the 7th step to the reset input. And now we divided our clock that's triggering the hi-hat by 6. And this works for every division from divide by 1 to divide by 8. Let's remove this reset for a moment. Let's turn up these sliders. When I don't connect anything to the input of step 8, these separate steps generate 5 volts. We can get this from the scan output or from the separate analog outputs. And you can imagine that when I turn down, for example, these sliders, connecting the scan output to another drum sample triggers that drum sample, and this gives us a clock that's divided by 4. Let's connect this to something else. Let's take a cowbell. Can never have enough cowbell, right? Let's turn these down. Let's reset our steps. So we have a divide by 6 here. And whenever you choose an even number of steps here, you can make subdivisions by just sliding some sliders up and some down. You could do something like this. But you don't need to stick to clock divisions, you can just approach this as a trigger sequencer. Notice that when I slide 2 sliders up, the second one won't generate a gate signal just because the signal at the output is 5 volts on the 4th step and is also 5 volts on the 5th step. So essentially here we're just creating a gate of 2 steps. And once we start combining all of these techniques in one patch, Step 8 can do awesome things. Let me quickly show you an example of what I mean. So here I'm using a clock. There's some swing to it. I'm also using it to trigger a hi-hat. I'm connecting this clock to the step input on Step 8. I'm also going to connect some pink noise to the input here on Step 8. Step 8 is in sample mode. I'm going to use the all setting here, and this switches on the cycle setting. Let me connect an oscillator here. So I'm sending in pink noise. I'm stepping through the steps with a clock. And by now you probably already know that the signal we're getting from the scan output is a classic sample and hold. Now for this example I want it to be a little more musical, so I'm running this CV signal through a quantizer set to a minor scale. Now let's trigger a kick drum with the first gate output here. And let's trigger a snare drum with the fifth output. And then by attenuating these sliders you have some kind of control over the pitch sequence, at least for the steps that you turn completely down. I think this is nice. Now instead of running the VCO straight into the mixer, let's run it through a filter. For this I'm going to use filter 8 here. Let's choose the 2-pole output. Let's switch this to audio. And now I want to modulate my filter with an LFO. For this I'm going to use Generate 3 in low mode. I'm just using the fundamental or sine output. Let's increase frequency. Now I want to modulate the frequency of that LFO, and for this I can use one of the analog outputs, and it's for this reason that I switched this switch to the all setting. Now it's no use using one of the outputs for the steps that are completely attenuated, because analog outputs will also just send out 0 volts there, but let me choose the fifth one here, and I'm just connecting this one to the exponential FM input of my LFO. And if I increase the effect here, and as you can hear, the frequency of our LFO changes every time the fifth step receives a new signal when it samples a new voltage from the pink noise that I'm sending in here. And you can go absolutely haywire with this. You can set up some phase modulation and let one of the analog outputs of Step 8 control the amount of that, or you can use these outputs to modulate the length of the decay and attack on envelopes. You could even use one of these analog outputs to try to trigger a sample. Let's choose the clap here. And this should give you some variation, because this will only trigger the sample when the voltage of the second step is high enough, so it won't trigger the sample every time. Of course, this depends on what module you're triggering. For this demo, I've been using the new SLD drum sampler by Soundforce, but I'm currently on the 707 firmware, which is completely awesome, by the way. And this will be it for this video. I'll copy and paste the link to all the documents you saw in this video. You can just download these. If you liked the video, please share it with someone who is looking for an interesting sequencer that can actually do a lot more than sequencing. The sequencing behavior of Step 8 is really just a byproduct of it having sliders. If you're interested in access to some exclusive downloads, you can always visit my support page, which is ko-fi.com/Dries. The link is in the description somewhere. Thank you very much to the people who already supported me there, by the way. If there's any questions about Step 8 or any of the other Joranalogue modules, please contact me. I'm also available to do lessons about these. I try to focus primarily on the Joranalogue stuff here. I can also do some one-on-one stuff for Chaos Leibniz. And of course just general patching, Eurorack tips and tricks. If you're interested in any of that, please contact me. My email is somewhere in the description as well. I hope you learned something. Thank you very much for watching this video. Until the next time. Bye.